I was at a Memorial Day barbecue yesterday, and one of the things I try to do is somewhere in the course of an event, I try to get to everybody there and talk to them just about different things and just engage them. That's what I try to do. And I said, I came to this one guy who was 45 years old, and we started chit-chatting about his life and the day and different things. And he looked at me for a moment and he said, "Could I talk heavy for a moment?" I said, "Yeah, I do heavy." I said, "Yeah, I can do that." And we were just sitting there and he said, "I'm 45 years old." And he said, "I have absolutely wasted my life." And he said, I don't think I'm ever going to have the things that I want most. And he said, "I don't have a family." He said, "I'm not married." And he said, "But I've been married twice." But he said, for whatever reason, he said, I just don't see that happening for me again. And most of all, he said, kids. And he said, now I'm obsessed with this. Kids and grandkids, all my friends. And he said, it's like a sermon I heard maybe a year ago, where Moses comes to the end of the journey. God takes him on the mountain and says, "Moses, you've been a follower, you've been a leader, you've been great, and your times have been bad, but I forgive you." But he said, "You're not going into the promised land." And he said, "I feel that way. I feel like God forgives me, and I've been restored." And he said, he loves me, but he said, "I feel like as far as my dreams and the things I want, that God has said, but you're not getting those things." And I said, I can understand how you feel that way. But I said, outcome is not determined by all of the things that we think is. I said, we have this timeline inside of us that just is constantly thinking about what we want within this timeline. And I said, I want to just tell you this story. I said, I grew up in Evansville, Indiana, and when I was 14 years old, he said, to our city came a citywide crusade. This evangelist was a lineman for the Cleveland Browns, and then in the off season he was a crusade evangelist. He came to our city, and it was a big deal. All the churches, most of the churches were involved in this, and I said our church was involved, and I was 14 at the time, and I was involved, and I said, I went to these rallies, and one day the man that was leading the rally said, "You got a card in your hand," and he said, "I want you to write the name of the person on that card that you think is least likely to ever be a believer." And I thought for a moment, and man, instantly I write down the name of, really it was my next door neighbor. I didn't think that would ever happen. I mean, it wasn't that he didn't go to church. It was that he didn't even know church. He didn't even know about church. And he was the kind of guy, when the ball went in his yard, he'd keep it. Yeah, that's who he was. I couldn't ever see him being a believer. And so he said, the guy doing the rally said, "Now I want you to pray for him every day." He said, "I want you to pray for this person, pray for this person, pray for this person." And he said, "Draw a clock on the card so you can know which time of day you're going to pray for this person." So I did, and I started praying for this man. And the crusade got closer and closer and closer, and I couldn't see anything different about him. And then the big night came, and I'm like looking around. I didn't see him anywhere. Second night, third, went all the way through, and I never saw him. The man never came. In fact, I don't even think he knew there was a crusade going on. I really don't. So you see, on the other side of hope is nothingness. You just forget about it. So my life goes on. In fact, I grow up. I go to college. I get married. I have kids. I'm pastoring a church, and for whatever reason, I'm asked to speak at a rally back in that community that I grew up in I guess now it's been 40 years ago. I was asked to speak there, and I was excited, going back and a lot of people I'd known since my childhood. And this guy picks me up at the airport, and we're driving in, and I said, tell me about this thing. And he's telling me about it, and this thing and that thing. And he all of a sudden says this name, and it's the same name of my neighbor growing up. And I'm like, what? He said, yeah. He said, he's one of the people instrumental in bringing this here. I'm like stunned. I said, you're kidding me. He said, no. He said, he was one of the people that from the very beginning worked to get this to happen. And I was dumbfounded. So here I am 40 years later, 30 years later, and who else is now this on-fire Christian believer bringing this meeting back to his community but my neighbor from when I was 14 years old? Now, we have this timeline, and if it doesn't work out in that, I said, we just forget about it. Well, wasn't what God wanted. God has a different timeline. It's his timeline. It works on his clock. And sure enough, there he was. Now, you will never make me believe that my praying as a 14-year-old didn't have something to do with that man being there some 40 years later. Same is true in your life. You've got this timeline, and if it doesn't work out in that timeline, you just forget about it. You just forget about it. He doesn't forget about it. He's still working on it. You may never see it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Remember that. I'm going to remember it too. Subscribe to this. Subscribe right now, and I'll talk to you again.